Good day, everybody. Welcome back to the Coptimizer podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Flanley, and today I'm here with Chief Chris Cowan from the Cayce Police Department in South Carolina. And we're just going to jump right in. So, Chief Cowan, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for spending a few minutes with us. We've got a few things that we're going to talk about today that I think will be really interesting for our listeners. But before we jump right into that, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. Where is Cayce, South Carolina, and how did you get into policing?
Oh, wow. Well, so Cayce, South Carolina, we're in the Midlands of South Carolina. We're adjacent to the city of Columbia, the capital city of South Carolina. We actually, as a city, expand about 12 and a half square miles from everywhere from the Columbia Metropolitan Airport all the way out, coming across the Congaree River into Richland County. So we actually police in two counties. We've got a great population. We've got 372 some odd storefronts and a population of about 14,000 people. And it's a dynamic community. We're growing a lot. We've got a very bedroom community in some areas, but then we've also got a lot of development coming in. We've got some big 24-hour industries: Nephron Pharmaceutical, Dominion Energy, CMC Steel, some big industry as well. So it's kind of a diverse, dynamic community. But one of the neatest parts about it is we've got a city council who's tremendously supportive of policing. We've got a city administration who's tremendously supportive of policing. And it's exciting for me because in October of last year, I was blessed with the opportunity to come in as the police chief. They were the Department of Public Safety previous and divided into fire and police. So they hired a fire chief and a police chief. The exciting thing for me is we were able to create a whole new police department, a whole new structure, a whole new dynamic of policing and new vision and new mission. And so it's been really, really exciting and fun. Been here almost a year now. I was in Richland County for 29 years. I worked for Sheriff Leon Lott. People know Sheriff Lott nationally as being very progressive, Sheriff of the Year, and somebody who is very, very involved in community policing. But the thing I learned from him most was that true community policing is the most aggressive form of policing because you're educating, you're creating awareness, and you're doing crime suppression. And so I learned a lot from him. He's been one of my coaches in my leadership journey throughout my career, and personally and professionally. But it's been exciting. It's been a lot of fun. I've got a beautiful family. My wife works in the hospital industry. My daughter works for the federal government. My son works as a lineman for a local, one of the cooperatives, electric cooperatives here in South Carolina. And so very blessed to have a very, very supportive family. And, faith and family are huge to me. When you come into my office, the first thing you see is a group of pictures of my family and my Bible. Behind my desk sits my Bible. Faith and family are very, very important to me. And so it's just, I don't like making it about me. I don't like talking about me because this job, this career is not about me. It's about the path that God has set me on and the opportunities that, one of the things I've learned in my career is it you have to make a decision. Is it a got to, or is it a get to? Do you get to go to work? Do you get to do the things and the opportunities to serve others? And, I think it all depends on how you look at things. I look at things as a get to, as an opportunity.
That's a great way to frame it. I actually have that conversation with my kids from time to time. That's so fascinating getting to come. So you have 29 years of experience working with a large police department. I think you said right around 1,000 officers, somewhere in that area. But then you get to build a police department from the ground up, taking all the lessons that you've learned from your career. That's kind of like it's like, give me a little bit of police Play-Doh here and get to work.
Well, I'll tell you, the exciting thing is that I'm really blessed because, again, I've got a city council who understands what it takes to be a police department and what it takes to police. A city administration. I worked with the city manager previously when I was in Richland County. She was in Richland County at one time, and the assistant city manager, he was the number 2 at the police department for many years. So it's very easy to talk about what are the things that we need, what are the things we need to do. But more importantly, I'm very, very blessed to work with 72 people who are very passionate about policing, and they're very passionate about this city. And the vast majority of them, we've hired some new people. We've brought new team members on board, but that again goes to leadership, and it goes to surrounding yourself with the best people, the people that are smarter than you. I'm not the smartest person in the room. I'm not the smartest person in this department or this city. I just quite honestly believe that there's always somebody smarter in a conversation than you. And if you look at things that way, you'll always open yourself up to learn something from the conversation, no matter what somebody is saying or what the topic is. And so again, I'm blessed. I've still got the support of my previous boss. He is the sheriff in Richland County. I've also blessed because I went to the FBI National Academy with the sheriff in Lexington County. So the two counties that I'm policing in, I've got great relationships. And I think that's the interesting thing about South Carolina that I would say is we have such tremendous positive relationships with our state, federal, and local partners. We've started some new programs. There's I think 6 or 7 new police chiefs in this general area where I'm policing. And the neat part about that is that we're all excited about working together. We don't have territories. We don't care about jurisdictional boundaries, and we're sharing resources and we're sharing ideas. I was on the phone this week with the police chief, neighboring police chief, and he was telling me about some of the things that he was having some challenges with. And through that, I'm like, he was solving his problems, and I'm like, so that's great. So I don't have to spend any money on solving that problem because you've got that resource. And he's like, yeah, absolutely, you can use them, you can do, So I mean, it goes back to relationships. It goes back to how you treat people. It goes back to how you realize that you've got to create relationships and build bridges, both with the community and with your fellow local, state, and federal partners.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I feel pretty fortunate. That's the environment in which I worked. Had a very supportive mayor. Of course, my mayor was once one of my bosses on the police department too, and we actually have 2 mayors that came from our police department. And now they work in cities side by side, and we work very well with our county. Great relationships, and that builds a lot of synergy in a community.
Oh, absolutely.
And it also speaks to the value of working together, the value of community support. And again, I know oftentimes we feel like maybe that as a country as a whole that people don't support the police. If you were watching the mainstream media, that might be your big takeaway. But in some of our greatest times of strife, if you want to call it that, based on things that have happened in the policing profession, we've never had more support. And everywhere I've gone, the people, this show has afforded me the opportunity to talk to a lot of leaders from around the country. And the real story is most communities have a tremendous amount of support for their police departments. And even the most outspoken critics of police departments still support their police departments, and they still need them. They're just looking for those right relationships. And I think oftentimes the right bridges to communicate, so everybody understands that we're all heading towards the same endpoint, right? We want safe communities. We want communities that thrive. We want a place where everybody gets a chance to grow up and experience the American dream. So, wow, sounds like a ton of great things going on down there.
Well, and I would mention too, you mentioned that about, the divide in this country, and let's be honest, there are people that are divisive, that prefer to divide. They want controversy. They don't want to solve a problem. They would rather have the controversy. And let's just be real. That is a fact. They're in every community. But we still have to sit at the table, and we still have to talk to the people that want that divide, because there's still something to learn from that. It's frustrating, it's disappointing, it's disheartening. But I use I tell people all the time. I think I told somebody this the other day. They were asking me a question about this topic, and I said, let's look at the example of Charlotte, North Carolina. They had riots in Charlotte, North Carolina. There are 1 million people that live in Charlotte, North Carolina. They estimated there were 10,000 people that were rioting and protesting at the time. Think of the percentage of the population that was actually rioting and protesting compared to the population that probably thought what was being done was wrong, and that was the wrong way to go about it. My point in saying that is that you have a percentage of population in this country and around the world who don't like the police, who will never like the police, who will teach their children to not like the police. But that's part of our job. That's part of our responsibility to accept that. But the question you have to ask yourself is, if you're truly wanting to be police in this day and age, are you willing to ask the question, why do they feel that way? Why is that? Is there something that we did, the people wearing this uniform, to cause that to happen? And quite honestly, we have to take accountability for that. But the thing I believe in is police should be held to a high standard. They should be held accountable for those standards. Totally agree with that. But I think it's also incumbent on police departments across this country to do two things. Number one, hold the community responsible. Small example is alarms. False alarms, 85%, 87% of false alarms in this country, alarms are false. Well, instead of us continuing to respond and divert resources to that, we can simply hold the community responsible for doing their part to prevent those, forcing them to put second call verification and all these steps in place. My point in saying that is that we can in turn hold the citizens accountable for changing their behaviors that cause victimization. 99% of Americans will be affected by crime, and 98% of crime can be prevented. Well, the prevention piece is on the cops, but it's also on the community. We as cops can be held accountable, but we also have to hold the community accountable for doing their part. And part of the issue that law enforcement is having in this country is we continue to be put in the position where we are doing non-traditional policing things because people aren't being held accountable for the crimes they're committing. We're criminalizing mental health, and we're criminalizing adolescent behavior. So I would say that those are three separate topics that we could probably talk about for days. But the point is that the system has to hold itself accountable for fixing the criminalization of mental health and the criminalization of adolescent behavior. The second thing that I think policing agencies we have to do is we have to run ourselves as a business. We have a commodity that we are selling. We have a budget. We have to market. We have HR. We have everything that the big companies have. Axon has, pharmaceutical companies have. We have the same situation. And everybody says, well, you're not selling a commodity, you're policing. We are selling a commodity. We're selling customer service. We're selling crime prevention. We're selling criminal apprehension. We're selling holding people accountable for the crimes that they commit. So my opinion is, and this is just my opinion, is that we have to hold ourselves accountable, hold the community accountable, but then we also have to run ourselves as a business with our budgets, with our operational capacities and capabilities, and the things that we do every day, because we do have commodities to sell, in my opinion.
Yeah, there are a lot to unpack there, and I like that concept for the people that because I've had this conversation throughout my career. Can you compare us to a business, because we don't sell widgets, right? We don't have a fixed commodity that we're developing. We don't know what price we're going to sell it. We can't predict the marketplace. But like any other business, you can prepare for what you think the market is going to do with your product. And for us in policing, and again, this is just my perspective, the one thing that we do know is we have data. And we have a lot of things that we can look at that can be predictive in if we know what happened last year, last month, last week, we can be predictive about what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. Now, there's always things that can influence that, but not only can we be predictive, but then if we have a good understanding of what's going on inside of our data, that maybe it is just 1% to 2% of our population that's driving 95% of our work, then we can be very specific about how we're going to assign our resources that are going to drive value for what we're doing in our agency. And I think sometimes we get busy in let's just say the alarm example. That's a perfect example, because that's a high frequency call that drives very low value. Yes. But what it does is it occupies time. So an officer he could be spending time sitting maybe on a drug house or looking for fugitives. A lot of things that we know where we could focus him on core issues that we have to pull that resource away to be able to go and manage false alarms, if that's the community's expectation. So, and I know a lot of police departments move this way. We went that way. It caused a little consternation with some of our business owners and people in the community, but we we made a decision that if we come and it's a false alarm, and there was not an active burglary, and it's most likely an issue with your equipment or from your alarm provider, then we'll give you one on the house, but if we have to come back a second time, there's going to be a fine, and that fine is going to be progressive. And it's not to generate revenue for the police department; it's to free up time for the valuable resources that we have, because our human resource is a fixed commodity. That's a fixed. I can't add the number of police officers that I have. So if I'm handling 110,000 calls for service every year, I need to be able to tell my community members where I'm focusing their time and resources. And do you want them focusing on false alarms, or do you want them running traffic details in our busiest intersection where we're having the highest number of crashes and where that's impacting people personally?
The alarm thing is no different than let's say a pharmaceutical company who's producing gloves. If their assembly line breaks, then their commodity that they're selling is not being produced. So in the sense of the alarm situation, I take a different approach. I don't believe in the fining. I believe that we basically say to them, look, these are the 3 things that you need to do. And if you'll do these 3 things, then we'll come back. If you're not willing to do those 3 things, then if it's an actual criminal issue, we'll come back. Other than that, we're not, we just and hold them accountable for that. But again, the assembly line that's broken there is easy to fix. You got to get a repair person to come in. Same thing with the alarms. You got to get a repair person to come in and educate and do these different things. So I do think we have a commodity to sell. I think it's different in the different precision policing. Keyshawn, who's the police commissioner in New York, she and I went to the NA together, and one of the things that she was talking about recently was precision policing, and that goes to the education of our force, the leadership of our force, to what we do every day and how we precisely and accurately provide services. And I think that it's no different than a business. That's precision policing is no different than the precision of the commodity, whatever that commodity is that your business is selling. You have a budget, you have human resources, the human capital that you have to care for, and you have to make sure that you're doing those things in order to provide the commodity that you're selling. And I believe that we are selling a commodity. We're selling crime prevention. We're selling criminal apprehension. We're selling customer service. We're selling community service. So anyway, just my humble opinion.
So I like that expressing precision policing, because it is, I think what it does is it focuses the mind. Policing is a very broad subject, and you mentioned it earlier. There's a big ask in the modern era of policing about the things that our communities want us to do. Crisis intervention, your mental health preparedness, protecting your schools, doing your crime prevention, on top of everything else that police departments have traditionally done. So sometimes it might just come down to something where it seems complex, but it really is simple when we talk about what we're going to focus on and why. And then your community partnerships really go a long way when you have those relationships, and you can be very specific and have those conversations about what you're going to do, why you're going to do it, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, what the community's expectations can be for the police department, and what the police department's expectations can be from the community.
Oh, you have to absolutely, and you have to clearly understand both sides, what both sides want and what both sides need in order to provide that commodity. And that precision is determining where you're going to allocate the resources, but also, is the public going to accept where you're allocating your resources? If they don't know why you're doing what you're doing and how you're doing it, then they're not going to accept it, and they're going to assume that what you're doing is not beneficial to them. I think we saw recently there was a study done in several minority communities in this country. They were asking the question, do you want the police in your community? Do you like the police? Do you need the police? And everybody said yes, yes, yes. They just want to understand better why we prefer provide the services we do and how we do that. And the thing that I think most people will tell you is they have no idea that they know that mental health services are going away because their families have been impacted by it, right? 80% or 75% of the calls we go on have a mental health component to it. And so we know that everybody's impacted by mental health or substance abuse. The issue becomes they want to know, then why are we arresting the person with their family member when they believe that their family member has a mental health issue or a substance abuse issue? Because quite honestly, the cops in this country, we only have two places to take people because the mental health facilities have been removed. We either take them to the hospital or we take them to jail. Neither one is able to provide sufficient services. So we've criminalized it. We put mental health patients, somebody gets, under a court order and they're required to go see a mental health professional. We put them in handcuffs and we put them back in the back of a patrol car and we take them to the hospital. That is criminalizing mental health. Mental health is a disease. We do the same thing with adolescent behavior. Look, I shouldn't be in this uniform. The things I did as a kid, come on, let's admit it. We all did things as a kid that we should not be in uniform, right? Right. But then we didn't criminalize adolescent behavior. We figured out a way to correct it and hold kids accountable. But, we didn't criminalize it. We've criminalized adolescent behavior now. So anyway, soapbox, sorry.
No, that's a great soapbox to climb on. And we'll keep those pre-law enforcement career activities for the post recording discussion. A lot of it is funny when you think about it, but it's also kind of sad in a way too. This could take us in a whole different direction.
I'm
but
glad I'm sitting down.
One of my favorite books in the last 2 years, one of my favorite nonfiction books that I've been encouraging everybody to read is The Coddling of the American Mind. It's written by Jonathan Haidt, and he had a co-author on the book, but psychologist. It really kind of lays out the path for how we've gotten to the point where we are in the country in terms of the expectation. And he defines it, the expectation for safety has been externalized and not internalized, and we're looking for others to keep us safe, and not just in a physical sense, but also in an emotional sense. And I'll let you read that. Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 down the road.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wrote it down, and I'm curious to take a look at that.
Yeah, it was one of those. I was listening to that book, and again, I mentioned that good friends with our university chief here, and I can almost track back to the day where we got into discussion about the resources that the university was going to provide for their students, whether they lived on campus or off campus. And there was a discussion in the book about why this was taking place, and a great generational explanation about I better be quiet there, because that'll be an hour-long conversation. What I really want to talk about is just go read the book, and then I'm
going to read the book. But what? You've opened the door on this, and we talked about this offline. But is this terminology? I think this is a segue. If you'll forgive me for doing this, I'm going to hijack your show for a second. Is this terminology of defunding the police? I believe that if you talk to true police professionals in this country, they will say that they don't agree with the word defunding, but they do agree with the concept of taking funds from what we're being forced to provide in, for example, the mental health field. We have to hire crisis intervention teams. We've got to hire psychologists and sociologists to be on staff. We've got to be able to provide these intervention services for substance abuse, whereas the police are having to do that. Well, if governmental agencies would want to say, okay, I'm going to take $1,000 from your budget and $1,000 from the 309 other police departments in South Carolina, and I'm going to combine that, and I'm going to take that money from you, Chief, but I'm going to provide this other service. They're going to take the $1,000 and they're actually going to save me $100,000, because I'm not going to have to provide that service any longer, because the people who should be providing it and who are trained to provide it will now be providing it. So I think this concept of where people say, oh my God, I'm going to defund the police, and the police are getting offended. Think about the word defunding. People are not talking about taking all of our budget away. They're simply trying to find the services that used to exist. And how do we fund those? And if those programs that used to exist were actually in existence today, we could focus on customer service. We could focus on criminal apprehension. We could focus on crime prevention. We could focus on all of the other things that we need to be doing. So I know it's unpopular for people to say, oh, Chief Cowan is saying that we should defund the police. That's not what I'm saying. Just look at the definition. This goes back to the European model of how we academically think. And that the theory behind define the term defunding. What does it really mean? And then what is the concept behind what is the root of the issue? And then what are the solutions? And if you look at the solutions, in actuality, what would happen if they took a percent of every law enforcement agency in this country and put it towards that? Eventually, other funding would come into play for us because that funding would be diverted to what's really needing to be done. So I don't know how unpopular that will be, and you probably want to hit the hang up button now, but
nope. Chief Cowan said it. He wants to defund the police. You heard it here, folks.
That's what I said.
Yeah. The other term that gets thrown around in that defunding conversation is the reimagining of police. And, it sounds good. I guess if you're out in public, but most of the people that I've heard say, we need to reimagine policing are people that don't know policing. They don't understand policing. And what they're really imagining is a world where the police responds in a different way. And in order to understand how the police can do that, you have to have a sound understanding of the way police departments operate. So I don't like it when people just toss around the terms because it sounds good. They read it on a tweet, right. Maybe one of their favorite celebrities or politicians has said this. What they do know is, hey, there's something that I disagree with or I'm not happy with, and I want to see a change. So this is the way that I do that. Now, the way you explain defunding is a lot different than in how it's actually transpired in certain communities where they literally are just taking money from the police budget, right. Without any understanding of how the police actually spend that money or where it goes. And generally what happens there is if you're going to remove something from a budget, just like you are in a business, you're going to have to make the decisions about, okay, I no longer have the funding. So what services am I going to cut? What services am I have to get back on? And the last thing that we want to have happen in this environment is the money being taken away from the training and development of our workforce, because you can give us all the best equipment, the best technology. But if you don't have the best people operating and driving that, then that's a waste of money. You're not going to get the value out of that. So yeah, that's it's a great discussion.
And you have to think about, okay, the most important commodity that we have is human capital. And the human capital is the commodity. It is on the policing side. It is on the community side. We have to invest in both. And again, I don't care what term you use, whether it's reimagining or defunding or whatever. Nobody's going to disagree with the fact that that you always have something to learn and that you always have a way that you can better provide service. But we have to invest in human capital. And one of the reasons that we're not recruiting, and we're not retaining, it's in some areas of the country is because of the fact that investment in human capital is going away because, like you said, they're taking money from the training budgets. And again, like you said, you can give everybody the best equipment. That's important. You got to have the best tools to be able to provide the best services. But at the same time, you have to invest in that human capital, and that human professional development, the human performance. And if you're investing in human performance, then you're in turn investing in a more professional policing service. So I think everybody says, well, we're going to get the experts together and the experts are going to sit around the table. Well, how long have those experts been disconnected from providing policing services? Do they understand clearly what is going on the streets, on the boots on the ground, and what do they need? Not what tool. When I talk about tools, I'm not talking about computers and MDTs in cars, and I'm not talking about body cameras because that's all important. What I'm talking about is the tools that they need in their toolbox to deal with the situations at hand. Example. I believe that every law enforcement officer in this country should be taught jiu-jitsu, because I believe that in order for you to reduce workers' comp injuries, suspect injuries, suicides, everything, you have to invest in human capital. They have to be confident in their own skin. They have to know how they're going to handle what their body will do and what their body won't do. And everybody's different. And there's been the study going on in this country of officers and departments that are investing in those programs, and they're reducing hands-on experience with victims and suspects because the officer has more confidence in how they're going to handle themselves, and they're using words. They're using the ears that God has put on the side of their head because they know if it crosses that line, they're going to be able to handle themselves. They're going to be able to protect themselves and the suspect and the victim. And officer injuries are reduced and suspect injuries are reduced and hands-on experiences are dropping because we're investing in human capital and we're investing in the human performance, and we're giving them the tools that they need to be able to care for themselves and care for other people.
Well said. And that, I think it's a perfect segue. And to close that up, what you're talking about is a theme in these shows that is coming up on every show. And I think ultimately what we're boiling this down to is, and especially when you think in terms of, we call them response to resistance incidents. Some people, some agencies call it use of force, but in the end, competence equals confidence.
Yes.
And if you are competent in what you're doing and you have a high level of confidence, that reduces emotional stress. It allows you to focus on what your issues are, and it is going to improve your performance. There's, the data is pretty clear on that. And there's been some great discussions about this because it goes back to what we just talked about. In terms of jiu-jitsu, most jiu-jitsu experts that I've talked to, I've got a great resource here locally that will tell you you're looking at, a blue belt. If you could get everyone to a blue belt level, that's probably a nice, a realistic point. I don't necessarily, I don't know enough about that to say yes. All I do know is that I can see the difference in when I'm watching a body cam video of a use of force incident where where you can tell if somebody is escalating too quickly or quicker than another. I shouldn't say too quickly, but maybe one officer is going to escalate quicker than another officer based on their individual skill sets and what they feel comfortable with. Right. When I watch a couple of my officers who are Division I wrestlers, the way that they handle themselves is completely different than an officer that's smaller in statute, that's comes from a background where conflict is not part of what they grew up with, and they've oftentimes never been in a physical altercation ever in their life, and that goes back to the coddling book. That they're going to approach that physical confrontation differently, and so when we talk about, again, diverting funds, defunding, reimagining, when you ask me what reimagining it is a much longer training cycle, a much bigger investment in our new police officers right up front, a longer training cycle with these types of resources, not just from a physical combatives perspective, but also in the tools that they're wearing. The firearm. It's one of our biggest liabilities that an officer carries on their person, and yet around the country, it's not uncommon to hear that police departments train twice a year with their firearms after they get out of the academy. I think most people would be appalled to know that, but that's the reality. That's the truth. And that is not good. You can't expect, that's a perishable skill, and you can't expect someone to perform at a very high level in this, what we would call a very low frequency but extremely high consequence event. So you've got some very unique experiences in your background, and and I'd like for you to talk a little bit about that, because maybe I think there's a lot of things that we do very well in American policing that are unique, but I also think that there's a lot for us to learn about the way other countries approach policing and the way that they train and educate their officers. So maybe tell us a little bit about your experience at the NA and the National Academy, and what that brought for you personally, and which now you get to return and bring back to your community.
Well, exciting thing for me is I have had a lot of opportunity to interact internationally. Bulgaria, Germany, the UK, Australia. In Australia, I was able to interact with, law enforcement from, the Southeast, Southeast Asia, to the Middle East, and had some experience with law enforcement in the Middle East as well. And the interesting thing for me is having the opportunity to talk in depth with people from around the world and what do they do to invest in human capital? What do they do, to deal with the challenges that are in the community that they face? Interestingly enough, when I talk, and I talk regularly with friends and people that I value as coaches from the Netherlands, from Bulgaria, from the UK, from Australia, and the challenges that law enforcement faces in the US are very, very similar to the challenges that are being faced in other countries in the world, whether it's driving under the influence, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's mental health issues. But the one thing that I will say that's different is the investment and the commitment to investing in the human capital long term. And I think that I'm talking about the commodity that is our team members. And I think what's neat for me, the perspective that I have is the belief and the passion. One of the passions that I have is investing resources into our team members to make sure that they have the tools in their toolbox to perform at the highest level possible. And so those experiences have really brought me to that passion and to that belief that we have to do that. I have a kind of I don't know whether some people might call it a little tainted thought process when it comes to what we do in law enforcement. I believe that leadership in law enforcement in this country, you're no different than a professional athlete. You have to invest resources. So let's use an NFL superstar, right? That person is invested in for their what they eat, what they drink, how they sleep, how they train physically, how they train mentally, the education that they go through every week of every day of every season, and the things that they do to hydrate their mind, their body, and their soul, right? How is that any different in leadership, whether it's leadership in corporate America or it's leadership in the policing realm? We have to do the same thing. You talked about reading Coddling of the American Mind. I talk about reading books like Fearless Leadership and books like The Seed by John Gordon and The Energy Bus by John Gordon. Those books that I think that are about us replenishing what's in our mind and our hearts and our souls about how we deliver the services that we provide. So I guess what that international perspective that you mentioned has really brought to me is the belief that we're corporate athletes. We have to run our agencies as a corporation, and we have to run ourselves as athletes. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to, because let's be honest with you, the statistic in this country is that most law enforcement that retire, I think it's 2 or 3 years after retirement, they're dead. And it's because of the pace that we lead. And if we don't care for ourselves along the way, but we also don't have coaches and leaders in our lives that are going to force us to take care of ourselves, then we are going to die after we get out of law enforcement, after we get out of public service. And that's horrific to think. So that international perspective has got me thinking in a little different mindset. I believe that we have to take care of the human capital, and we have to make sure that we're investing in that. I think they do that better internationally than we do here in this country. We have a retention issue and a recruitment issue in this country because, in my opinion, we don't look at things from the investment side. And how are we investing, whether it's in leadership, whether it's providing coaches, whether it's providing mentors, or having the annual check-ins, the monthly check-ins with psychologists. I mean, anyway, I'm getting on my soapbox, but I do have a different
my language. That's kind of why we're here, right?
Yes.
That in America, sometimes we look at what's the minimal investment we can make and get the maximum in return.
Yes.
And that may work when you're talking about products or building a product, but that does not translate well to human performance and people. That is there are certainly ways that you can look at it and say, hey, here are a few basic things you can do in order to maybe get to 80% of what you're capable of. But that other 20% of what you're capable of is that, that requires significant time and investment, resources, expertise. And one thing that we also do in policing, I think we do a very good job of sharing knowledge, but sometimes, the knowledge, the further you get away from the source, we lose a bit of that knowledge. So getting back to, and this is why I think that the concept of coaching is so powerful and so important, because now you can get to industry leaders, whether it's sleep management, whether it's stress management, whether it's physical fitness, whether it's nutrition, whether it's emotional well-being, spiritual well-being. There are a lot of experts, and there are a lot of people that not only are willing to share that expertise, but they're practically begging to share it because they see the impact that policing can have on individuals, and they want the best for their communities. And so I always get excited when I hear people talking in the way that you're talking, especially when I hear it from police chiefs, because that's what's needed.
All right, so let's think about this, and let me just make this other analogy. A police department is the same as a professional football team, and this is why. There are positions within the police department and on the football team. There are opportunities for injury in the policing as well as they are in the football. Well, so let's talk about the football team. They prevent injury in professional athletes by doing what? By training, right? By educating, right? By what they feed, what they drink, how they train, protecting their heart, their mind, their body, and soul. So, people will say, well, that's a stretch, Cowan. How can you make that analogy? Well, let's really break this down. If you want to really look at the theory of policing, and again, that coaching concept that's over here, that a lot of people say, well, we need mentors in law enforcement. I'm sorry, we can get on this conversation another day, but I don't agree with mentorship. I believe in coaching. Mentors make decisions for people. They drive people to change. Yes, absolutely. Do they help them? Absolutely. But they make decisions for people. They provide the solutions. Coaches teach people. They guide people. They take people from one level, and they take them from the minor league to the major league. They coach and they guide and they drive and they pull out what's in our minds and in our hearts and in our souls. That's what a coach does. And so I believe that the professional athleticism, the corporate athlete that law enforcement is, I think there's a direct analogy to it, because again, whether it's jujitsu, whether it's leadership training, whether it's providing coaches, whether it's investing in human capital, we're doing the same thing. We're just providing a different commodity. They're trying to put the ball through the uprights. We're simply trying to prevent crime and capture criminals. But we still have the humans involved that we've got to invest in and we've got to provide. And again, if you're not protecting their heart, their mind, their body, and their soul, they cannot police and they cannot throw touchdown passes. Is there not an analogy there? Is it not the same thing? And are there not coaches on the sidelines for football teams? And do there not need to be coaches on the side? If I didn't have coaches, I would still be a transactional leader. And most of my career as a leader, I was transactional. I was very mission oriented, very vision oriented, and I was getting things done. And we were having a lot of success, but success doesn't equal significance. And I think the coaches in my life, the Paul Butlers of the world, the Leon Lotts of the world, the Jim Hudsons, the Wade Fullers, the Mark Plaids, those people that have been in my life that have coached me and said, look, these are the things that you've got to be. They didn't give me the answers on how to get there. They just were honest with me and told me the errors of my ways and the mistakes that I was making. And then they helped me find the solutions, and they invested in me and they coached me, and they do it every day. And I'm blessed to have 5 or 6 people in my life that I can go to and say, look, this is the challenge that I've got. And they say, what do you want to do? What do you mean? What do I want to do? Tell me what to do. No, that's not how coaching works, Chris. Coaching works by us, but you've got the answer inside of you. You just have to listen to it. Learn from your mistakes. Don't make them again. And those are the things that coaches do. And again, I'm sorry, but I think that analogy is very clear in the fact that we've got to think of ourselves as corporations, and we've got to invest in human capital. And the way we do that is by coaching and leading. And really, what is the theory of leadership and what is the theory of coaching, and how do we apply that to what we do every day?
So if we continue along with this analogy, football teams have budgets, police departments have budgets. They're going to make a decision about where their spends are going to be which key personnel they're going to bring in. One of the challenges that police leaders have is 90% of their budgets, anywhere from 88 to 92%, generally speaking, are fixed spends, where the police chief has zero impact or influence on how that money is going to be spent. It's going to be on salaries, on insurance,
fuel,
all those things.
Right.
So when you get down to it, you're talking, anywhere from 2 to 5% of that money is where the chief has some discretion on how it's going to be spent. And when you're thinking, how do I get my staff trained in jiu-jitsu? How do I get them to that high level of competence? How do I get them to a high level of competence and maintain them there with their firearms? How do I get them through drug recognition school and the crisis response training? All of these things, if there are not funding mechanisms that are coming from outside their budget that are going to help support them, then they've got to come up with that internally. So when you start talking about a formal coaching program and how do we invest in the individual officers to start to develop them where if they're not already on that path of being lifelong learners, how do we put them on that path? And then how do we teach them to manage themselves? And this is one of the observations that I've had, and I've talked about this on previous episodes. I like to bring it up with guests, especially when they're so passionate about it like you are. But and maybe you may agree or disagree with me here, but I've been to some really excellent police leadership schools, staff and command. I've been to state and local leader program at Harvard, a lot of other shorter management type of schools, and we're very good at teaching these technical and tactical skills, the things that we need to know, what we should be aware of. But what we're not very good at is teaching individual officers on how to manage themselves. How do you get the most out of yourself every day? Because it goes back to that observation that if you put a broken person into your system, it doesn't matter what kind of car you put them in. It doesn't matter what brand of gun you put on their hip. It doesn't matter what CAD and RMS system they're using. It's they're not going to get the most out of it. And I think as chiefs, sometimes we frustrate ourselves because we expect high performance, but we're guilty of low investment in the individual. So how do we maybe in just moving forward, how do we get chiefs to and communities, really councils and mayors and managers, to understand that we have to invest in these types of programs, and we have to get the capital outlay to spend to make sure that we're getting the benefit in return that coaching brings?
I would see. Okay, this is a coaching moment for me. I believe that, and this is the question that somebody asked me several years ago. You simply ask a council member, you ask a mayor, you ask a city manager, you ask county manager, whatever, and say, would you hire a finance director that had no formal finance training? So let's say they graduated from the university, they had a master's degree in political science. Would you hire them as your finance director to handle a $166 million budget? And I think the vast majority of them would say no. And you're like, well, why? I mean, they've got a master's degree. I mean, they're smart, they're educated, they're articulate, right? I mean, you've heard them speak, and I think that, human resources director, would you hire somebody who has maybe got a physical education degree? And again, I'm not downplaying any of these degrees because they're important, but would you hire somebody who was a PT instructor, or would you bring a drill sergeant out of the military and bring them into X, Y, or Z role? Would you hire Chris Cowan to build a rocket ship to go to the moon? You would not do that. We do it every day in law enforcement, though. And we promote people from patrol officer to corporal, or from corporal to sergeant, sergeant to lieutenant. And we don't have the the standardization normally across this country, where yes, we do say, okay, well, if when they're promoted, they're going to go to a formalized training class and they're going to go to first line supervision. Okay, that's great. That's important. That's a good foundation. What about a coach? What about assigning them a coach? What about assigning them benchmarks that they have to meet every month of every year in order for them to, whether in their education? I think internationally, I think that's one of the things that happens. And I know, for example, in Queensland, one of the things that I notice in Australia is that when you go from, inspector to superintendent, you have to have met certain educational components, and you have to have had certain criteria that you've had to meet. And I think that oftentimes city councils and county councils, they don't listen to the agency heads when the agency says, I need to increase my training budget by X amount of money. And the reason I need to do that is because I've got to be able to provide the tools to invest in the human capital. And that usually the training budgets are the first to be reduced. And when you do that, the perishable skills that you talked about, they go away. And you can't take perishable skills away from police officers, because when you do that, you are reducing their ability to provide professional policing services. So to answer your question directly, I believe that we have to invest, goes back to that investment in the human capital, and we have to make sure that we're setting benchmarks for the leaders as we build them in their careers. I've worked my way from a deputy sheriff all the way up to a deputy chief in the largest sheriff's department in the state of South Carolina. And I did that because of the fact that my boss was coaching me, and my boss was investing in me and giving me the training that I needed, but giving me the day-to-day, every once in a while, 2x4 on my backside, saying, look, you're making mistakes, and these are the things that you've got to do to improve. But he was investing in me, both financially and emotionally. And so I'd say to city councils and county councils and mayors and administrators all the time, my point would be invest in your human capital. You will retain and you will recruit by investing. Stronger investment in that human capital will retain people long term, in my opinion.
Well, preaching to the choir here. And I think one thing that, again, I think a lot of Americans would be surprised to know is that and maybe it's different in South Carolina, but across the country, generally speaking, there are no mandates to provide leadership training for supervisors. It's generally something that's
left to the agencies.
It's left to the agencies, and I do think, while it sounds bad to say, I do think that policing probably has never been better in America, but that doesn't mean it can't be better and continue to get better. And, that it's all a matter of perspective about where you come from. So there are organizations that do a very good job. The public sector, you made a great analogy of that. In the private sector, I should say, you're not advancing through your management hierarchy and structure without the right credentials. The credentials backed by experience and demonstrated competency in whatever field it is that you're doing. You would just never, it's just not happening. And so you and I were both in the service, right? You were in the Navy. I was in the Air Force years and years ago, but there was kind of a mindset, if you were in long enough, if you were in for a year, you'd go from airman basic, if you were enlisted, right? You go from airman basic to airman. And in 2 years, you go to airman first class. In 3 years, there were times all you had to do was make it in a time perspective. It wasn't until I think even in the late 80s and early 90s where the military started to have a big shift. I think they'd always done this in the officer ranks, but we're going to say, look, if you're going to progress in the service, you're going to have to meet certain levels of competency, and you're going to have to demonstrate that. And so we're going to send you to NCO prep school and then NCO leadership school. And the military now has a very formalized education system built in. I have a lot of friends that are veterans that have done a lot of different things in their career, and they talk about this, these stages of development. And that's not something that exists inside of policing, writ large. And I got into an interesting discussion about this analogy of and in all this discussion about the militarization of the police, people are concerned about that, a whole nother conversation. But the the special operations community in the military, let's just say, for if you're going to go into, you were a Navy man, so if you're going to be a Navy SEAL, you're going to go through close to 2 years of training before you ever get assigned to your first team. And then when you get to your first team, you have very rudimentary and basic assignments, because they're going to stress you and they're going to test you in that, and then they're going to develop you further. So you're talking probably anywhere from 3 to 5 years before you become an experienced SEAL team member. Policing is not like that. In most places, your academies are 12, 14, 16 weeks. And then if you come from a small community, you go right back to your community. You may not have a formalized training program. You might not even have an FTO. You might not have that coach. And you have the same exact responsibilities as any other police officer in America. You have the authority to arrest. You have the authority to take a life if it's necessary. And that's a huge responsibility. So if you wonder why we have these huge disparities in development, well, it's because it's the resources that we provide. And then I've talked about this also previously, but that's what we call, when we have bad outcomes, then we focus on the individual and we look for the flaws in the individual. Well, it's a biased decision. It's an anger decision. It's X, Y, and Z, but never do you hear the discussions, well, it's a preparation problem. It's a training issue. We haven't invested sufficiently. And so now we had a bad outcome and we're blaming an individual officer when the officer was in a position where they never had a chance to succeed, or they were set up for failure by the system that we put them in. So, that fundamental attribution error, blaming the person rather than the system that they're operating in. And that's where I think when you say the community needs to invest just as much as the police department does, because we're all responsible for community safety. Community safety is not just a police responsibility. That's every citizen. I used to say this a lot in my community talk. Sometimes it didn't go over well. It's like people would ask me, "What are you doing to improve XYZ?" And my first question back sometimes was, "Well, what are you doing? What are you doing to help with that problem?" Well, that's not my problem.
Citing Robert Peel. Sir Robert Peel.
Yeah. Peelian principles, they're 200 years old. They're as, I think, probably as important today as they were then. What's old is new again. But that's a long way of saying, investment matters. Development matters. Coaching matters.
Absolutely. And you even mentioned it. When I first started, I worked the road for 1.5 years before I went to the academy. I mean, I was basically given a gun and a badge and put to work for 1.5 years as a police officer before. And now that was 30 years ago, but that hasn't changed that much. We take young men and young women and we put them in the academy 8 or 12 weeks. We put them with a field training officer for 12 to 15 weeks. But again, that's independent of each department across this country about how long their FTO program is. I think we oftentimes say, hey, you're going to get promoted to sergeant, you're going to get promoted to corporal or whatever the rank is. And we pat them on the back and we say, congratulations, job well done. You're now going to go supervise your peers. And that in and of itself is a challenge. How do you deal with that? And so we have to invest and we have to make sure that they have the tools that they need in order to establish some sense of authority, but then more importantly, the difference between being a manager and a supervisor, the difference between being a manager, a supervisor, and a leader, and how they get coached through that and what tools they're given. We're on the same page, absolutely, unequivocally. We just have to do that. But here's the other thing that we forget about. Okay, let's say that they say every police department in this country is going to get a 10% increase in their budget for training. What they're forgetting is that we also need an increase in our budget in overtime, because when we take the people off the street to go to the training, we've got to make sure that we're still providing policing services. We're not like a business where we can shut down the conveyor belt, for a day. Yeah, that's going to impact the business on a negative because they're not going to be producing their product, but they're not impacting the safety and security of a city by shutting down that conveyor belt. If we take police officers off the street, we're impacting safety and security. So let's make sure that we're clear when we're talking about this. Don't sell yourself short as the leader of a law enforcement agency. When you're asking for training money, realize that if you ask for $100,000, you really need about $160,000, because think about that $100,000, how it's going to be spent. There's going to be $100,000 you're spending that's probably going to impact about 60 or 70 people over 20 to 40 hour training classes. You're going to have to pay people to fill those positions. And I'm not trying to insult any leader that's already knows that, but I think I'm speaking more to the city councils and the county administrators and the people that are making the decisions, that when police professionals come to you and they say they need X, Y, or Z, in order to retain and recruit people, it costs more money to hire somebody new than it does to provide a little bit more overtime funding and a little bit more training funding, so that they have those perishable skills and they're maintaining those perishable skills.
Well, that's another reoccurring theme in these shows when we talk about the cost of officer turnover. And again, I think that's another hidden cost that most communities don't recognize.
Absolutely.
That when you lose a 20-year veteran because he retires early, he's burnt out, he's had enough. Maybe your department is 10 to 15%, down on manpower. Those calls for service don't slow down. The demand on police services don't slow down. So when you're working short, you have to do a couple things. You have to pay people overtime to come in and fill those positions, but now you're asking people to do the job longer. We're not getting these cycles of recovery that they need physically, spiritually, and emotionally. So when they come back to work,
right,
that they're at their best. And that is so. I mean, I do think that you need to speak directly to police chiefs and tell them that, when you take on these leadership responsibilities, your primary job is to get the resources for your people. And that needs to be number one. And that's how you're going to have success. And if we go back to that special operations model, and here's another thing where the military gets right, and we saw the cracks in this in our last 20 years because we were in a wartime environment for one of the longest stretches, if not the longest stretch in American history. You send a military unit, they deploy. If it's a special operations team, they're deploying generally for like 3 to 6 months at a time. Then they come back. Well, then what do they do when they come back? They go into a rest and recovery cycle where they're not working. And then from there, they go into a training cycle where they're taking all the lessons that they learned on their last deployment. They're learning from the folks that are still downrange. They're taking all those things and they're applying them, and they're learning them in a training environment. And then they're getting ready to gear back up to go back out. A police officer does not have that luxury. They never have. They're going out for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, oftentimes longer than that. They go home. They get minimal amounts of rest and recovery, and they go right back. And, if and inside of police departments, there's always good discussions about, who feels the pressure the most, right? Patrol officers are, they always have those, interdepartment conversations about who's working harder, right? And it's generally anyone other than you. I'm always working harder than everybody else.
Doesn't matter what unit you're in. It's always,
it's always there, right?
Right.
I joke about it, but it's a serious problem, and we spend trillions of dollars on our national defense, and we expect them to be able to defend the sovereignty of this nation and to do it well. And I think they do it extremely well, but we don't. We domestically speaking, we have a very similar expectation for law enforcement, but when you talk about investment in comparison, it's minuscule. And we don't, we argue about what are the best shifts, 8, 10, 12 hours. There's been a lot of studies that have been done on this because, ultimately in all those studies, what we're looking for is what's the right amount of time to leave somebody out to stress them all day and then bring them back and give them ample recovery time, because that's what they need, is the recovery time so they can recharge and be ready to go back out into that environment. When really what we should be talking about is if I have a staff of 200 employees, maybe I need 300. And if I had 300, then I could always have somebody in a training cycle. I could cycle them through some of these higher stress environments. We are a 24/7 business. We work all night long, all year. And sometimes I tell people I worked midnights for 15 years.
Wow.
A couple of those were evening shifts, but I loved it. I loved the work. And it wasn't until I got to be around age 40, 42, where the impact of that finally caught up with me. And I realized, okay, I'm, working nights maybe as a younger officer's game, even though, my heart was still there. My body was like,
Right.
all right, this, you need to maybe take a different approach. And, that can be a whole different conversation, but yeah, I mean, investment. I think that's the theme that we keep coming back to, is investment.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what it's all about. And the only way that we're going to fix this recruitment and retention problem in this country is to have the backing of our city councils and our communities to do exactly what you described. Them, what the military is doing is exactly unequivocally what we need to be doing. That cycle is spot on, and it's been proven time and time again that is the way. You've got to rehydrate, you've got to train, and then you've got to perform. And again, it goes back to corporate athleticism. That's what the professional athletes do. They compete on a Sunday afternoon. They're recovering, they're training, they're learning, and then they're competing again. Well, if it's good enough for the NFL superstar and the Premier League soccer teams and the Major League Baseball players and the basketball players who are performing at the highest level, do we not want our police officers, our EMTs, and our firefighters performing at the highest level? Well, if we do, then why don't we take an example from the professional athletes, from the military, from the highest performing corporate athletes out there, the Boeings and all of these companies that are performing, they have the same sort of cycles in their professions. Why is it any different for EMTs, firefighters, and police officers? It's because it's expected. Well, they want to serve, they want to wear the uniform, and then we're going to provide them. You said it at the very beginning of the conversation, minimalistic. We're going to provide the minimalistic amount that we can to get the highest performance, but then we're expecting them to make the decisions that take somebody's liberties and could take somebody's life. Those are two decisions that police officers do not take lightly. So if they don't take it lightly, why should any of the bureaucrats do that? They shouldn't. So we have to decriminalize mental health, decriminalize adolescent behavior, and we have to invest in human capital. We have to do it.
Well, we could talk all day, but I want to be respectful for your time. And that is a perfect, I think, ending for today's conversation. But before we go, just a couple of fun things. I consider them fun because I love to read. What's the latest book that you've read? What's the last book you read? It can be fiction or nonfiction. And I generally tell people, like, you've already talked about, how faith is important to you. Usually when I ask this question, what's the most important book you've ever read? The Bible, hands down. So we're going to say outside of the Bible.
Okay. The book that I read most recently was The Shark and the Goldfish. The great part about The Shark and the Goldfish is a lot of pictures. Okay, so it's an easy read. You can read it in about an hour. But it's a great book because if you really get into the theory behind it and you really listen to it, you have to make the decision: are you the shark or the goldfish? So it's a fun read. It's an easy read. I think it took me probably an hour or two. And if I can read it in that amount of time, somebody that's a lot smarter than me can read it in shorter. But Fearless Leadership by Chri is a very, very good book. I think she hits the nail on the head when she talks about leadership and her perspective and the things that she experienced in her life. But I really, my fallback, my go-to is John Gordon. I love the book, The Seed. I love the book, The Energy Bus. I believe that John Gordon epitomizes the foundation. It doesn't matter what level of leadership that you're at. I believe in all of his book. I think he's the other one I want to read of him is, and I looked recently, was For God's Sake Lead. I'm really dying to read that. But I just think that if you really, it talks about hunting the positive dog and finding the positives and all of the things that we really need to do as leaders. So, again, the shark and the goldfish is kind of fun because it's really basic, but it really goes to the root of how we're wired. And I will tell you that a turning point in my career was learning more specifically about how I'm wired and what my beliefs really are, and what are the things that I really function well at, and what are the things that I struggle. And so finding out what the chemical imbalances are in your mind and your body and your soul, and learning about how you're wired and what your true beliefs are and how you function, and then how you align yourself with people that are wired differently, and how you bring all those wires together and you be significant, not successful.
Fantastic. Well, so I'm going to have to do this for you. I'll be off camera for just a second. When I was cleaning out my office, I'm trying to figure out, I have a couple giant bookshelves here in my office, but this book is sitting right on the top of my pile.
There we go.
From one that I kept in my office, and from time to time, I would pick this up and I would read it. I have read The Energy Bus. That's a fantastic book. What about nonfiction? Are you a nonfiction reader? I'm sorry, a fiction reader.
Not really. If I'm going to have time to read that, then I'm probably just going to watch Game of Thrones, or I'm going to get on and watch Premier League soccer, because those are my go-tos. No, I don't think so.
Well, I did read all the George R.R. Martin books long before the series ever came out, and I can tell you, it was a fascinating read. They were long books. It's like reading Clancy. It's like sometimes it's like the books never end, but very torturous. A lot of plots and twists and turns, and I think anyone that's watched the series, you learn very quick not to become attached to any one character. If you're looking for your hero, your heroine, your protagonist in the book, yeah, you're going to be disappointed. But hey,
I appreciate what you're doing, though. I'll tell you, I think that what you're doing is spot on, and I think it's great. It gets us thinking. I've learned from this conversation, and anytime you have a conversation with somebody that you believe is smarter than you, it's always beneficial. So I feel like
I don't think I'm smarter than you, and you said something earlier about I was taught by a very smart person, right? That he used to always tell me, if you think you're the smartest person in the room, then you're probably in the wrong room.
Yes.
So I've always tried to remember that, and this show has been amazing because I get the opportunity to speak with leaders like you and others from inside and outside the profession. I think what I'm really hoping for is that we all learn from each other, and maybe some people that need to hear these podcasts, or the right opportunity will present itself, the right person will read it. I think the common theme throughout each one of the shows that we've done, and we're early in the show, is leaders recognize that our people are our greatest asset. We need to invest in them. We owe it to them. We need to make sure that we hire them healthy, retire them healthy, and give them every opportunity to have success in this career, because this is the opportunities to impact your communities and to do great things for your community, you're not going to find in any other profession. Policing is unique in that there's a lot of great professions out there, right? But man, every day we're dealing with people in crisis. It's a hard thing, but when you take the right approach and you have that right core belief system at the end of this career, man, I've been in a contemplation phase, because I'm 6 months removed from my chief's position. I spent 10 years as a chief, and man, it's like, wow, now that I've got a chance to kind of sit back and think about all the great things that people in our agency have done, and the impact that we've been able to have on our community, and I'm excited for the future to see what they're going to do next, and that's also awesome. So
yeah, absolutely.
Thanks again. Appreciate it. You have a great day, and we'll have to talk again soon.
I look forward to it, sir.
If you're in law enforcement, consider getting a coach, and do so by going to axoncoaching.com. Check us out and contact us today. Until our next episode, I'm 1042.